Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the latest edition of our class in Pirkei Avot. Last week, we concluded our two shiur mini-series on the spiritual value of work, looking first at, let's say, a theory of the value that is within work, that work itself as a kind of way of a metaphor for what it means to engage in your spiritual activities, and also to find the spirituality within your working life. And that's not just jobs, but also all the ways that we deploy and organize effort and exertion in anticipation or to result in something meaningful. And then the second week, we looked at what the kind of psychological implications of that would be. To view all of our lives as something of potentially infinite worth that could easily redound to overwhelming or an immense amount of pressure, feeling burnt out, in the contemporary locution. So we looked at ways in which Torah and the rabbis interpreting this tradition um, of everyone is obligated in the work, but no one is allowed to desist from it. Right? Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, but lo ata ben chorin libatel mimenar. Right? We all have to pitch in and do our part, but we're also not obligated to finish it. To try to come to a sense of reasonable expectations for ourselves and how to create a culture of sustainability in the way that we devote ourselves in our activities. Today, I wanted to take these kind of like theoretical things that we've looked at, namely how to view our effort and exertion as a spiritual activity, and then also how to process that and organize our time and our effort and our intention and our energy towards sustainable results, to now apply it directly to our spiritual lives. How can we look at our Torah study? How can we look at our mitzvah work? How can we look at our prayer lives? How can we look at the ways in which we try to bring goodness and righteousness to the world? How can we think about these things not just as kind of individual activities, but rather as a vocation of sorts, as a plan, and as a way that we organize our lives? So this is where the rubber hits the road. It's where Pirkei Avot is providing some, I think, not just, let's say, theoretical advice, but also really trying to give us tools towards application in our religious lives. So let's get into it. Can everyone see the texts okay? Zoom, zoom, zoom. Okay, so we're looking at a very famous passage from two rabbis who might be the same rabbi. Why do I think that? Well, we'll get to that later. First, we'll look at the first passage of Ben Bagbag. Actually, I think we'll look at them both. First, we'll look at the passage from Ben Bagbag, and then we'll look at the teaching from Ben Heihei. Very fun names. And we said in a previous class when we looked at the Brisa Rebbe Akiva, right, which is the sixth pseudo chapter of Pirkei Avot, we noted that the true tractate of Pirkei Avot ends with chapter 5. So these are actually the concluding teachings of the original edition of Pirkei Avot. So have that in the back of our mind too, and we'll get to that at the end. This is not the last class in our mini-series, although maybe it's worth announcing the class will be wrapping up at the near the end of July. So we'll have advance notice of that. But we will be looking, I think, at these teachings with a sense of why are these kind of resounding, concluding words that are being included at the end of the tractate. So first, let's look at Ben Bagbag. Ben Bagbag says, who wants to read this? Let's do it in Hebrew first, because it's worth having the poetry of the language. Ellen, I know you've been practicing your Hebrew.
I'll read it. Ben Bagbag Omer, Hafoch ba v'hafoch ba, Yichola ba, Uva techazeh v'siv uvlei va, Umina lo tazua she'ein lecha midah tova hemena.
And this is where I apologize, because part of that was in Aramaic. But still, it's Judeo-Aramaic, and it's based strongly in Hebrew, so you did a great job adapting to that. But let's try to get the the Hebrew parts first. I think we can get it. Lahafoch, like hafuch, means opposite, right? Hefech means opposite in Hebrew. So what does the verb lahafoch mean, you think? Well, don't look at the English. Let's try to figure this out ourselves. So it's if it's the opposite, it's to reverse it, to turn it over. So turn it over and turn it over. Dechola ba, because all is in it. Uva techze, or chazon means re'iyah, means vision. So in peer within it, look within it. V'siv uvelei ba, grow old and seasoned with it. Grow old and gray with it. Age with it. Even in a way like wither with it. Umina lo tazua, do not depart from it, don't abandon it. She'ein lecha midah tova himena, for there is no greater measure or greater characteristic than it. Okay. The Hebrew is, or the Semitic, is rhythmic, it's terse, but it's pungent. It's very powerful, I think, in the way. And a lot of these teachings are kind of like koans of sorts. Not koans, like Adam Cohen, but like koans, like Zen masters, kind of terse riddles. Right? These are very tersely aphoristic. These are very aphoristic teachings, and there's a lot of space because a lot of it is just very small phrases with lots of open space around them, as it were. Yeah, Lauren? I heard somebody. Okay, never mind. I'm going nutso. All right, so how do we just react to this? How do we respond? Anything come up for us? Turn it over and turn it over, for all is in it. Let's just start with that first clause. What does it mean? What do you think Ben Bagbag is calling on us to do?
Look into it carefully. Just really, really do it. In modern terms, do a deep dive into it.
Okay, great. So do a deep dive, and you get that from the language. Where do you see that? So what are we turning over?
Turn it over.
What's being turned over, though, in that reading?
It is referring. So could the it be Torah?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think
Torah,
it is Torah. It is for sure Torah. But more when I say but in relating to Torah in that way, what is being turned over in your reading of it?
In my reading, you would look at the Sukkim, and you would really, really concentrate on the pshat, and you would look into the commentaries to see what is said about it, so that you do as much study of those Sukkim as is possible.
Okay,
and
so
also
thoroughness,
your own meaning too. Yeah.
Okay, thoroughness, availing yourself of resources. Okay, paying attention to how you're responding to it. Great. How else are we taking this? What does it mean to turn it over? Turn it over.
Looking at different perspectives, trying to look at different interpretations.
Okay, great. So that there's a notion that Torah is, has many different sides to it, as we're going to get to later, right? So the notion, like, just because you come to one reading, maybe don't stop there, because there's other ways you can be looking at it, right? The most common phrase we see in the literature of Midrash is davar acher, right? Another reading, another way of thinking about this, another comment. Okay, great. When it says all is in it, how do you take that? Very strong claim, right? Very totalizing claim. So when Ben Bagbag says all is in it, what does he mean? All of what?
All knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
All knowledge.
Okay. All knowledge, like, of the world.
Everything you need to know.
Okay. Okay. So everything you need to know is in there. Okay. So like it's an almanac of sorts. It's your one-stop shop, because all you need to know is in there. Great. What else do you take to mean all is in it? We're going to see other, we're going to encounter interpretations of this that are, let's say, more grounded in textual hermeneutics, right? What it means to engage and interpret the text. We're going to see ways to take this in which it's actually a bridge between you and the text. Like, what is in it? What is in Torah? Becomes a question to really ask in a way. When we think of Torah, what do we mean? When we regard Torah, what is it that we are regarding? When we relate to Torah, when we study Torah, what are our intentions? What do we expect, and what can we hope for? Because the question, in a way, is what is inside of it? Right? What is the content of this object? Yeah, Susie?
Isn't Torah sort of like, it's like the universe, but in written form? Like, it's all encompassing. It's everything and everyone, and I don't know. That's sort of how I think of it, that it's supposed to be representative of like the whole universe.
You're intuiting a very, very, very neat teaching that we're gonna see soon. That there is a relationship between the text of the Torah and the world, in which one is kind of commenting on the other, or vice versa. So we're definitely going to get to that. When I find the Ben Bogbog's kind of persistent comments, look into it, i.e. stick with it, go deep into it, grow old with it, thinking back on the past two classes, is a counsel of sustainability, of persistence, right? That the relationship with Torah is a long-term relationship. You grow old with Torah, right? You sit on the porch with Torah and watch the sunset together. You watch your kids grow old, right? You dandle your grandchildren. Mina lo tazua, you don't depart from it. And we're going to see with the next teaching why especially that is an important thing to share, or to insist on, or to encourage us about. Not just because there's nothing greater than it, but also because it might not always be easy. It might be painful. It might be challenging, right? That this is a relationship, like any worthwhile relationship, that has ups and downs, that has easy times and difficult times, and not just easy and difficult as in good and bad, but rather meaningful times come with difficulty often, right? The most meaningful experiences of your life come from non-simple, complex, even challenging events. So let's continue to the next teaching from Ben Hehe. And when I said they might be the same guy, the reason is because Bogbog is Bet Gimel. And what is Bet Gimel in Gematria? Bet is?
It's 2 and 3, so it's 5.
Good. And Hay is?
Hay is 5.
Good. So Ben Hehe might actually be the same guy as Ben Bogbog. Yeah, it's a theory.
But he would be
Unclear.
10. He's 5 and 5.
Yeah, so it's been 5-5 and been 5-5. Again, like, maybe, who knows. They only show up here. They don't show up anywhere else in rabbinic literature, so it's not like they ever talk to each other, so they could be cognomens. And this is
Those names haven't continued. No one's calling their kids Bug or Hay.
I mean, one of these days,
Okay.
Well, I mean, you can call your I guess if you name your kids Hey, and then their grandkid could be named Ben Hey, and then you just, then what more fun would you have then? Okay, so here comes this, okay, so even though Ben Hey doesn't appear again, or Ben Bogbog don't appear again, this teaching shows up all the time. This becomes one of those, like, real, just like, you should know this phrase. So, we tend to focus on the meaning of the text, and we're not like drilling people on the language, but, I do try to make sure we're doing a lot of it in the original. But that being said, this is a 3-word saying that it's really worth having, as we're building our familiarity with rabbinic literature, right, with Torah. It's good to, you're learning this stuff. You're a student of Torah. You're building your lexicon. You're building your otsar, right, your treasure trove, your storehouse of resources. You have a right to this material. So, know this 3-word phrase, because it shows up all the time in Jewish, discourse. Lefum tsara agra. Again, more Aramaic. I will not apologize. Lefum is lefi, tsara is hatsar, and agra is haschar. According to the tsar, tsuris, is the schar, is the reward. Okay? According to the tsuris is the reward. what do you take that to mean?
The harder you work at it, the greater the reward.
Okay, that reward correlates to our efforts.
Yeah, you'll
Okay.
understand it better. It'll mean more to you.
Great. Okay. Okay. Because the harder you work at it, the more actually you will apply yourself, and then what you can achieve through that application is greater because you'll be spending more time and more intensely. Great. How else?
I think maybe it depends. Your reward depends on the type of labor.
Mm-hmm. Say more. Is that good? Is that better?
Pardon me?
No, I'm now just being very yeshivish. I said say good. I said good. Now say better. I.e., just like expand on that.
Well, I mean, it's your choice of what the labor is, depending on what the reward is. So, like if your labor is helping people every day, then your reward will be greater.
Mm.
Even though you might not work as hard as somebody who works on their feet all day, like
Right.
doing like menial labor.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I am importing the English translation from Safaria, although I did actually erase some of them and write my own because I didn't find them sufficient. But this one I kept it. It says according to labor, but here I think labor, think of like birth, right? It's laboriousness is what it means. It's not labor like because the Sa'ara doesn't mean labor. Sa'ara means pain, difficulty, tsuris. So it seems like there is some kind of correlation. Now, when you're saying the quality of the labor indicates the quality of the reward, and the two are tied to each other. I think that's true. And I think Ben Hey is also getting at the fact that, nothing good comes easy. I.e., if it did come easy, it's cheap. All right, but rather things that, require a course of study that takes 5 years, right? The result of that is that you attain a certain kind of mastery way more than just like a one and done, 1 year master's or something like that, right? Like you have, and not just that, but also I think what we're going to get at is that for something to yield its full potential result, it requires a certain kind of resilience because you're going to have peak moments, but you're going to have low moments. And thus, Ben Bogbog, and that's why I'm thinking they not just like gematria-wise they're the same person, but these two teachings come together. You can't have the fruit without the exertive labor of farming. You can't have a relationship with Torah without also being told, don't desist from it, don't leave. Ein lecha reshus lehibatel mimenu. You're not ben chorin to depart from it. Because lefum tsara agra, because the difficulty of it is actually not. It's not the opposite of. It's not keeping you from what success looks like or what advancement looks like, but rather it's actually the stuff of what advancement looks like. Don't shrink away from it because it's hard. Rather, the fact that it's hard means that something's working. Now, I'm not, I think some people take this as license then to be a pain or mean or cruel or, hard driving. And I don't think Ben Hey or Ben Bogbog or the Ben Hey Ben Bogbog industrial complex are giving us that license, but rather I think it's descriptive. It's a very realistic advice in terms of what the world is like. Not just the world, but like in terms of how world functions. What it means to be alive, right? That to expect goodness to come with cheap thrills cheapens goodness. Worthwhile things are hard, often. So let's go back to turning it over and turning over, which will occupy, I think, the majority of our study, but let's go back to the Meforshim, to the commentators. Rambam, with whom we should be familiar by now, says, it says Susie say, there we go. The chat bar. Can't see it because it's covered by the thing. Okay.
Sorry, I'll just
Susie,
say it. I just
yeah.
well, I just don't. I just not sure. Like maybe it's just the translation or the words, but like to me, it feels like you're talking about like resilience and endurance and dedication. But
Mhm.
they're talking about pain and difficulty and maybe suffering. Like I don't think those are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah, I
you
don't
don't
think
need
it.
to
Mhm.
have a pain. I mean, yeah, I see what they're saying that like,
Mhm.
you know, you remember like the things that you had to come to difficultly better, but just because they're like I feel like they're trying to say you got to stick with it, not
I
you
think
got to
that's Ben Bog, but I think Ben Hey is getting a little bit farther, like in the sense of, like maybe one side is just like as like no pain, no gain kind of thing.
which
But I think there's a difference between like suffering and pain, and I don't think Torah is endorsing suffering per se. But resilience, right, is developing a tolerance for pain, right, for what is challenging, for what is not tolerable at the moment, right? It is expanding your capacity for tolerance. Um, and in that way, like I think we're going to get to that later because I think we're also going to talk about like I think what kind of pathways for what it means to relate to Torah that this opens up for us. So I think your pushback is quite well noted, Susie. I want you to like put that on the back burner. We're gonna get back to it because first we're gonna like kind of go through the romance of like the Torah study lifestyle and the infinity of it and the mystical nature of it, and then we're gonna get to like what does it mean though to really have that fantasy and then to realize like that reality and fantasy don't always match up. All right, like I'm never gonna come here in this class and be like, and like I believe strongly in Torah, I believe fully in, in the Masorah of Moshe Rabbeinu, and but that belief has come, is not like a one that cannot include, I think, complexity, and one that cannot include, I think, the different ways people relate to it. It's really important that that belief has come to through resilience, not through, I think, fantasy. So I think we're going to kind of go through that journey together in this class. So Amru ala Torah sheyafoch ba v'yageba mipnei she'akol ba. So as the Rambam says, that they say about he might actually have a different edition of the Mishnah, and we're going to see that maybe Abu Lafia had a different edition too. It's interesting. So it says they say about the Torah that one should turn it over, and one should contemplate it because all is in it. V'amar uva techzeh. And he focuses on and peer within it, and that might make sense because he is a philosopher and he's thinking about inquiry. He says, "Ratzon lamar ha'emes piresh v'sira ha'emes ba'ayin aseichel ketargum vayar v'chaza." So it says peer in it. He means find the truth, i.e., look within and identify the truth, perceive the truth with your mind's eye, right? With the eye of your intellect, but with your mind's, i.e., using your mind, right? As it is the Aramaic translation, vayira v'chaza, right? He saw is translates v'chaza. I think here he's just making sure we know v'techzeba is Aramaic. Achar kach amar v'sivu v'leba. Afterwards it says, and grow old and gray with it. Klomar, hitasek ba ad et hazikna, gam azlo tasur mimena lizulata. That is to say, one should engage with it and stick with it until one's old age, and don't shy away from it to commit yourself to something else. This is not, I would say, giving us more than just elucidating the teaching. But here I think we have an important point that hit asekba ad eis zikna is not something that happens by accident. Engaging with it, sticking with it, committing to it until your old age implies that this is a lifelong relationship. Learning Torah is not just going to Monday night Pirkei Avos class, but it is developing a steady, consistent relationship with Torah. And here's the empowering element, that it really, in a way, is not directed by you, because it's important to have teachers and important to have guides and things like that, but rather it's your journey. It's your old age you come to. It's your life with Torah that you're crafting. Right? Torah is your accompanier. You're on a road trip with Torah through the rest of your life. But for that to be true requires that consistence, and that persistence, right? To stick with it. Comes the Midrash Shmuel, which we've looked at before, which is a really neat anthology. I'm coming to really love it as I've been preparing these classes, because it's so I'll say flamboyant. Its readings are just so passionate, and I really love it. So let's look at this moving forward. It says, "Efshar od lefarish." One can further interpret hafochba v'afochba. Turn it over, turn it over. V'lo yamushu mipicha dekula ba. And don't let it depart from your mouth. He's citing another verse. Because all is within it. That is to say, liot ochel ha'olam hazeh v'nochel ha'olam haba. Eat in this world, but inherit the next world. Hakol yusag ba ki orech yamim bimina. All can be attained through it, for the length of your days is in God's right hand. Orech yamim smola osher kavod. Right, in the left hand, God has wealth and happiness and dignity. Which is all to say that through Torah, one is able to both gain access to a way to navigate this world, and also, go through the portal into the next world as well, because the orech yamim, right, the length of your days, implies it's not just practical advice about this world, doing mitzvahs in this world, but also that it bears fruit in the world to come. But here's where the thrust of his comment comes. Inami hafochba. So if that's the case, hafochba, turn it over. The achar shebeoto apam havana achat. Chazor v'afochba pam acheret. And after you've come to one understanding about Torah, return to it and turn it over again. So this was, I think, getting at what I was hearing Ellen implying, that it is, in a way, wrong to believe that Torah is about knowledge. It's not about coming to an answer, but rather it's about the practice of reading. Right? It's not about the result of having read it, figuring it out, but rather it is about what seems to perhaps be a never-ending re-engagement with what Torah can mean. Hafochba ve'achar shebeoto apam havanat havana achat, and after you've come to one understanding, return to it and turn it over again. V'tavin bo havana acheret, and you'll understand a new understanding. Yoter amuka, even deeper than the first. V'chein bechol pal mufam, and so in every single time you do that, it just gets deeper and deeper. You get deeper and deeper into it. Shetafoch ba mereshe dekra l'sefe madrish. From the beginning of Scripture, i.e. from the pshat, to the end of what one can hermeneuticize from it, right? From what one can draw out of it through reading, through interpretation. V'chein misefe l'reshe, from beginning to end and from end to beginning. Turn it over, turn it over, turn it over. Ula'olam, forever, tavin bo chidesh acher. You will always come to understand, a new, novel, and even I would say innovative reading of Torah. Lefi de kula ba, because all is within it. I mean, think about that, right? Like infinity. If all is within it, it's inexhaustible. So in a way, like, stick with it till you're old is kind of common sense, because there's no end to this. Udevarim sovlim perushim rabim ki shivim panim laTorah. And its words suffer many interpretations. Now the word suffer is very interesting, because it's used metaphorically. But I think again, the note of resilience there is quite real, like that we're talking about in terms of bearing with something, right? That Torah suffers, well, do not suffer a witch to live. It's that kind of use of suffer, right? Do not. The Torah bears many manifold interpretations, and because as the Talmud says, Torah has 70 faces / facets. Okay, so what do we take? What are we taking from this Perush, from the first Midrash Shmuel? What kind of relation to the Torah is the Midrash Shmuel encouraging or describing?
It's your constant companion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's giving you, Torah's been compared to water, right? It quenches your thirst. It's a constant source of new understanding and engaging your mind, engaging you spiritually. Actually, I learned a very interesting thing this morning on a shiur I'm taking, and it's the teachings of the Piasener Rebbe.
The Piasetzner.
Yeah, Piasetzner, who was like an amazing person. But he was talking about how, well, it started with like he saying Baruch Atah Hashem. The Atah is like kind of almost chutzpahdik. How could it be Atah? You wouldn't say that to a king or queen. But, so it means that really you're working on a personal relationship with Hashem, and Torah is Hashem speaking to you and you speaking to Hashem as prayer. But what she emphasized, the teacher this morning, was he taught that within everybody, there's like a secret, and it's like a secret spark. And that's when you she described it as when you suddenly are reading something in Torah and you have like a new understanding of it, right? A chidush. And it's so personal to you that you really feel it, and you maybe couldn't even explain it to another person because it's so deep inside you. I thought that was like an amazing teaching, but I think it feeds into this too. The Torah is like mamish, really a part of you. It's not only something you carry and you learn with other people on your own, but it's something that's like, if you really work at it, could be deep within you and give you new insights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. So that just for some historical context, the Piasetzner Rebbe was the Rebbe of Piasetzn, which was the suburb of Warsaw, and eventually, tragically, he became the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto. And his teachings are an incredible testimony to spiritual resilience, to find meaning within immensely troubled times. The Yechiel Michal of Zlotchev, who was an early Chassidic master, took these technical terms from Kabbalah. He said nigla and nister. Right? Nigla means like exoteric readings of Torah, like the pshat, the halacha, the normal stuff. And esoteric readings, the hidden stuff, right? That's what we think of being Kabbalah. But for him, he said, no. Nigla are exterior readings, i.e. ones that can be explained to someone else. You can justify them. You can recourse to grammar, to syntax, to historical context, to the discourse of law, whatever it is. But nister, esoteric, secret readings of Torah, he says it's like biting into an apple. You can't communicate the taste to anyone else. There's something radically individual and singular about everyone's life. That we can try to describe it, communicate ourselves to others, but no one will ever have the same experience. That's the challenge of poetry, right? To put into words what is beyond. Life is poetry in that way. Torah is poetry in that way. And what I find in the Midrash Shmuel, so on one side, right, we have Lauren's bringing the teaching of Piasetzner that there is something in us, right, that is unique, that is special, that no one else can recapitulate. Actually, the Piasetzner says, actually, that just like there are 600,000 souls in the people of Israel, kind of like symbolically speaking, and there are 600,000 letters of the Torah. So just like if one letter is gone in the Torah is puzzled, the Torah is invalid. So if one person's Torah is missing, if one person's relation to the Torah is missing, then it's gone. Right? It's invalid. Everyone's Torah is necessary because we all compose what the Torah is made of. And I think that's to be found here, right? The sense that Torah is not just what's a book. It's not the words in, covers of a book, but rather Torah is found in the engagement between you and the text, and what's born from that engagement. Right? Dekulaba, all is in it, means not just that it is immense and vast and infinite, but rather also so is the potential for your own meaning making with it and through it. There is no end to you coming to meaningful understandings of Torah, because it is infinite, because your engagement with it is infinitely generative. There's nothing less Jewish than thinking that there is a right answer to Torah. Right? Like Hellenistic, Greek thinking is about finding the singular truth, right? Cutting away all the falsehoods and coming to, through reason, coming to single truth. But Jewish thinking, Torah thinking, rabbinic thinking is about what truths can be produced, generated through authentic engagement. There's no end to truths. So let's go further. And appropriately, he continues to say, V'afshar od! And one can further say, right? There's no end to this. Shemar havocha, turn over. Lefi. Shematzinu be'oto hashalim shehaya doresh memtes panim tamayim memtes panim tahor. Said, we have found a story, he's adapting a story about God giving instruction to Moses, providing 49 interpretations of impurity and 49 interpretations of purity. This becomes like kind of a code phrase for let's call it the indeterminacy of law. I think, what's going on in the news right now with the American Constitution and the Supreme Court, it's become very clear in a way, right, that these law texts are not just there, but they are constructed through the ways that they are read. Right? Oh, this right is found in this central text, the Constitution. No, this right isn't found in that central text. How do you know? Because you have to make your case by crafting a reading of it. Right? Law is found through interpretation. It's constructed through interpretation. So, comes the complete one, i.e. Moshe Rabbeinu, who darshans out, who exegetes, right? When exegesis is textual interpretation, who exegetes 49 readings in which someone brings a case to him of something being, whether it's pure or impure. 49 reasons to say it's pure, 49 ways to say it's not pure. And he says, this is instructive. He says, V'afilu shahayu elu hafech elu. Even if these readings you come to, after turning it over and turning it over, going back to it and turning it over, are the opposite of each other. If they're the opposite of each other, let's call it normal Western thinking, right, would say there's a bug. Only one of those can be correct. Or it's incoherent, right? This is what's the law of the excluded middle, right, in classical logic. Or you can't have something X and not X at the same time. The law of excluded middle is if there's X and not X, then there's nothing else it could be. Well, I mean, if something is X or not X, right, what are the other options? Right, it's totalizing, right? It's yes or no, black or white.
It's Y?
Hmm?
If it's X or not X, can it be Y or Z?
That's
Or
not
Z?
X.
Okay.
Right? Listen, this is just like symbolic logic, right? Like if something's X or not X, you have two options and there's nothing else that it could be. Right? So here what we have is Moses saying, you have 49 reasons to say something's pure. 49 ways you're reading the Torah to say it's impure. And even if you see that like these are literally contradicting each other, And even if it seems at first glance that the first way you thought of it is actually the right one, and maybe you're like tricking yourself by like making this too complicated. Lachen amor, hashalim hazeh, amor hashalim hazeh, the holy complete one. Moshe Rabbeinu said, Al tishge b'ni b'svar azura, kazos. Don't get seduced by this idolatrous thinking. And I wonder if maybe he's like gesturing to like Greek philosophy. But regardless, don't get seduced by this reductive thinking. Rather, right? Don't get tricked into believing that all there are oppositions and that they must exclude each other. Rather, turn it over, keep on darshaning it, darshan out. Literally, if you're figuring out opposing readings, inverted readings, opposite readings, you're doing something right, is what he's saying. Think about that. Right? Ways to read it in which it's pure. Ways to read it in which it's not pure. Dekulaba. I mean, this is actually this is dialectical thinking, right? Like Midrash Shmuel anticipated Hegel. It's incredible, right? X and not X are related to each other, right? Because you can't have not X without X. And you can't have X without the potential for not X. Thus, there is a middle, as it were, in the sense that they are related to each other. They rely on each other. That's dialectical thinking. So, I mean, think about what they're saying about, like, here's a text, here's a central, it's the Torah. But it is quite consistent philosophically with if you're saying kula ba, if you're saying everything is in it, then it requires there to be opposites in it. Otherwise, it's not everything. This is where like Midrash is really just like on the road to Kabbalah. But I mean, it's an incredibly, I want to call it a mature approach to law. And not just to law, but to how contingent text is. That text is, we come to understand text through interpreting it. It doesn't just provide itself to us. We read it. And thus Torah means something. It's dependent on our efforts. And it's dependent on our commitments. And in this way, Moses is even saying, it's dependent on your ability to not get too precious. To not put your thinking first, but rather to really exhaust every single possibility you can come to. Torah is bigger than you, and it's bigger than even this question. Everything is possible through Torah. One side of that might be nihilistic in a way. Well, if everything's possible through Torah, then nothing's possible through Torah. That's not quite right. Rather, Torah is infinitely possible. And then the question of how you act, what you draw, what is wise to derive from it. Right? That's the next necessary question. Turn it over, darshan it out, such that it results in opposing readings. Some saying yes, some saying no. Since everything is in it, ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. These and those are the words of the living God. Yes and no at the same time. This is quantum Torah, right? It's indeterminate. It determines itself, or it becomes determined through our engagement with it. So here the Midrash Shmuel is citing this Midrash as a way of providing, I think, both the challenge and the promise and the fantasy, right? Of what it means to, I mean, it's like Torah study as the mystical contemplation of infinity. I don't, this isn't like giving us, I guess, permission just to like see whatever we want. There's a big difference between eisegesis and exegesis. Eisegesis means reading into the Torah. Exegesis means reading out of the Torah. An engagement with something means you bring yourself to it, but it's different than shoving yourself into it. Eisegesis means to read into it, right? To project into it. Exegesis means to derive from it through applying certain strategies of reading. There's a famous 13 strategies of hermeneutics that Rabbi Yishmael lists at the end of the Korbanos section in the Siddur. So there's I would say there's authentic engagements and there's Machiavellian engagements, right? There's ways to get the Torah to contort itself such that it says what you want it to say, but that's just turning the Torah into a tool to serve your ends. Whereas this is actually, it flips that dynamic. You, in a way, become a tool to suit the Torah. You are becoming the way in which Torah manifests, Torah actualizes, through your engagement with it. And it's only through you that, as we saw in the first interpretation of the Midrash Shmuel, that these new interpretations can come to be.
Question.
Yes.
So, couldn't it be possible then that there are infinite possibilities, interpretations, but the human element has to bring some sort of consensus, like you were saying about the law.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of an example right now, but keeping Shabbat, that's generally, pretty, I don't know if that's a good example either. How you interpret how to keep Shabbat could be a very different thing for everybody. So,
right. Well, that's the thing. He's not saying, Midrash Shmuel isn't saying, Torah says keep Shabbos and it says don't keep Shabbos. Torah says eat kosher and it's also saying eat treif. But I think rather that, within
there's been a consensus, well, let's say in certain groups. So this group says, well, keeping Shabbat looks like this. And this group says, keeping Shabbat looks like this. And then somebody might say, well, I keep Shabbat like this. It's different. So there has to be some sort of consensus to make it real, doesn't there?
Kind of. I don't know. In the sense that, again, it's not saying listen, there are the 613 mitzvot, right? But then the question is, how do these mitzvot actualize?
Yeah. So
right? Someone brings the chicken to the rabbi. Is the chicken kosher or is the chicken treif? Right? And the real posek knows that it, in a way, has more to do with the situation than it does with the book. Right? There's a lot of room in halacha to factor in all these different kinds of things. So the fact that, there's no such thing as the right answer, because it is complex, and I would use the word emergent. It's possible that it can go one way, and it's possible it can go the other way. The question is, in a way, what's the wise course of action? Because truth, in a way, is not determinative, but generative. Right? Truth doesn't compel us to say, well, suck it up, but the chicken's treif. But rather to find an authentic way to say the chicken is kosher, if that is the right thing to do. Right, the classic examples is if the person bringing the chicken is poor and they don't have access to other food, they just have this one chicken, they shechted the chicken, found out that there's, it's ambiguous whether it's kosher or it's treif. If there's ground to stand on to say that it can be seen as kosher, it's kosher. But you have to have a rabbi who's able to see the world that way and see engagement with Torah that way. It's not wrong. It's contingent. Right? It's made true. Because all is possible. Torah has given us all possibilities. The question is, when and where and how and why is it right to actualize those possibilities? There's some like obvious questions. It would be inauthentic to say, well, it's all up to interpretation, isn't it really? But rather that Torah emerges through engagement, just as life emerges. Right? Events in our lives present themselves to us. We can't control that. We don't, we're not living our lives top down. Life is lived from the inside out. And so, in a way, is Torah. Eitz Chaim Hi, it's not just like a living tree. It's a tree of living. It lives with us. I don't want to do the next one outside. Inside rather. I just want to kind of gesture to it and say that the last thing Midrash Shmuel gets at is saying like, and here's how you do it. What you do is you actually intentionally problematize the Torah. And this is what I mean when I say resilience is necessary in terms of what it means to have this engagement and this relationship with Torah. You have to actually come to a reading and then on purpose convince yourself it's wrong. You need to pick apart every answer you come to, because then only then can, when you are able to then do the second time you turn it over again, then you know exactly the weaknesses that you came to in the first place. I tried to teach this actually when I was in the university. I tried to teach this to my students when I was trying to teach essay writing. I say it's the strongest essay argument you can make, in which you can anticipate its faults, its flaws, and its limits. There's no such thing as a perfect argument. To present an argument as unassailable means only that you haven't thought it through enough, and that you don't respect the reader, and how the reader can read your text, your citation, and your argument differently. Resilience is what's required to be able to take apart your own theory. That's what I mean about not being too precious. It is about actually developing a commitment to something beyond your success, but rather towards the advancement of Torah. It's not about you coming up with a hot new idea, but rather it is about a constant and consistent engagement, critical engagement, with the way to relate to Torah's potential meaning. It's not about your answer, but rather it's about how your readings can serve the project of Torah. So here comes the mystical reading that Susie, in her own mystical glory, had intuited. This is from Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, late 19th, early 20th century Hasidic rabbi in central Poland, in Lublin. He's in the kind of the spiritual genealogy, the intellectual genealogy of the Sfas Emes, and he's a kind of a confederate of the Sfas Emes, and but in the line of the Kutzker, the holy Jew of where's the Yid HaKodesh from? And the Chayze of Lublin. And Simcha ben Prishischa. All of these very, in a way, like kind of a radical strain of Hasidism that wanted to get away from, I think, the more like, let's say, mass element of Hasidism, like to follow the leader, and kind of try to re-ground it in the engagements of the individual seeker. So here comes Reb Tzadok HaKohen is saying, he's actually drawing, ironically, actually, there's some confluence between him and the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who's the famed enemy of Hasidism. They actually have some similar imagery they use. But he says, Ha'olam kulo hu sefer she'asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What does that mean? Don't look at the English. We can figure it out ourselves. Ha'olam kulo. All right?
The whole world
Hu sefer.
is a book
She'asa Hashem Yisborach.
that Hashem blessed us.
That Hashem is made. Right? Yisborach is just like, it's part of Hashem. You don't have to translate Yisborach. V'Torah hu ferush. I'm getting some feedback. I'm going to mute you. Sorry, Lord. Torah hu ferush. Right? And the Torah is the commentary on the book of the world. Right? Torah is the Rashi on the Torah of the world. Sha'asav chiber al oto sefer, which God has composed on this book. Ha'olam hu rak roshem beheker ba'alma. The world is merely an inscription, a mnemonic. Va'al yedei ha'Torah yecholim lahavina harimizos shel haroshem beheker. And it's through the Torah that one can come to understand the signification, right, the hints of this inscription. Sheyesh b'ma'asim, which is found in the events, i.e. of the world. Alma shev'machshavato yisbarach, regarding what is in the mind of God. So what's the Torah? Do we get the metaphor that he's? I mean, it's very out there.
Yeah, because that means the Torah isn't even the book. The Torah is just the accompaniment to the book.
Yeah, but but Rashi's amazing, right? Like we don't, that's the thing. Like Torah doesn't end, right? The notion that a Perush is less than Torah. I mean, yes. Listen, like if I'm going to stack books, the Chumash goes on top, and then under it the Rashi. Fine, but more is more, right? There's not one answer. Torah is generative; it keeps on going. We're in a textual system. The world is a text. But, like we were saying above, texts only have meaning when they are read. So what's the Torah then? The Torah is the key to help the incoherence, in a way, of the world, right, find some semblance of meaning. The Torah, it's like you ever see the movie They Live? Rowdy Roddy Piper, I think, is the good. He puts on the glasses, and and he sees that these like seemingly normal everyday folks are actually like zombie aliens. Oh no! And he puts on the glasses, and he sees that these billboards are actually this hypnotic subliminal messages. So when we say that the Torah is the commentary to the world, it's not frippery or like extraneous. But rather, it is the way in which the world it helps us come to understand and find meaning in the world. That the world is written in like gnomic script, right? A script that is opaque to us. We can't read it or understand it. Only through this legend, right? Like in like the back of a highlights magazine, right? This key can we unpack and interpret, solve for, right? The Rubik? What's it called? They're like no, that's a river. No, the what's the thing of the pictures and the words?
Rubric? No.
Sure.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I forget. It's the thing where it's like the pictures. Rebus.
A rebus. Or
Yeah, rebus. Okay.
Yeah.
Anywho, point is, it's a code, right? The Torah is. I'm sorry. The world is a book that we can't read. Torah, right, is the commentary that helps us understand what the world is saying. It helps us piece together what its events mean. You can take that in kind of like a Nostradamus kind of way, a Bible code kind of way, but I don't think that's what he means really. But rather, Torah provides for us a framework of meaning that helps the world come to some kind of sense of coherence. Because it is God's, it is a rubric to God's mind. So gam kol ma'asev nivraya olam kulam he sefer shalem. Okay, so on one hand he says, okay, kind of like in the kind of the that Renee had intuited in this, like there's the book of the world, and then there's the mere the commentary of the Torah. Seems like it kind of demotes the Torah in a sense. But he says actually, every single event and every single creature in this world, every single one of them is actually a complete book unto itself. Shebo chakak kol otiot hamachshava derech elam gadol, in which are inscribed all of the letters of God's consciousness through or by means of great concealment, i.e., it is a secret inscription. She'ein shum nivra v'yitzor she'eino roshem al davar. There's nothing that exists, there's nothing that's been created that's not in some way an inscription of God's consciousness. V'inyan miyuchad machshavato yitbarach, and a unique disclosure of God's mind. Every single thing that exists in some way is a revelation unto itself. It's a mini revelation. Every single thing that exists is its own Torah. But it's a Torah that is closed to us until we engage in Torah. De lo tohu bira'ah. Nothing was created chaotically, senselessly, willy-nilly. V'akol bechavana miyuchedet l'ma'anehu l'kiluso v'liglot al yidei zeh kavod shamayim. Everything was created with the purpose and the intention, a unique purpose. Everything is unique, special, irreplaceable. Every single thing, every iota of existence in this world is its own book, its own unique disclosure that reveals to us God's praise, God's dignity, God's glory. So Torah is a meta text for the text of the world. Torah is literally a text. It's books, right? It's a book with words in it. But the world is also text, i.e., it means something, but can only come to mean something through our engagement in Torah. So we go back then to hafochba v'hafochba dekulaba, right? Because that's not mentioned here. But if you think about it, right? Just as we engage in Torah and turn it over, find a reading that's coherent, and then problematize it, pick it apart, invert it, turn it into its opposite, and then turn that into its opposite, and then keep on going. A kind of persistent, virtuosic attention that we lavish on Torah. But the world is a book, too, that needs to be related to with that kind of lavish attention. To attend to each and every creature as its own text that can be infinitely understood and infinitely engaged with and produce infinite meaning. Each and every creature and each and every created thing is Torah that can be turned over and found new things and special things and unique things in it, because each thing is a unique disclosure of God's mind. So we see now that the text of Torah and the text of the world start to develop a symbiotic relationship. Or rather, that symbiotic relationship becomes clearer to us. We can't understand the world without Torah, but I would say, lehefech, right? Vice versa. We can't understand Torah without the world. Because how do we understand? Well, actually, we're going to get to this below.
Okay, because I was just going to ask, well then, how did Abraham understand the Torah? Because he didn't have the Torah.
That is a huge question. It's kind of complicated to get into.
But I thought it was because he had this ability to, like, if we're using the book analogy, he had the ability to read the world, and so that's how he learned Torah.
Yeah, I think that's a very elegant way of putting it, right? That, like, for Abraham, coming to certain principles, right, was done through that kind of intuitive inference, right, by relating to creation, right, like a kind of like natural Torah of sorts, right, or he was able to attain like the spiritual Torah, right, but before it became codified into law as we have it. I think, Susie, let's check in after. Okay. So what I mean to say is, like, just like we need, so Reb Tzadok Cohen of Lublin is saying, just like we need Torah to read the text of the world, because it provides a lens or a framework that helps the world come to coherence. But also, we require the world to come to Torah because the world itself, then, each and every part of it, unto its very infinitesimal iota, right, is itself a complete world. And, which then I think inculcates in us, it trains us, it habituates us in terms of what it means to have that kind of persistent, attentive relationship. But we're going to get back to that kind of that symbiosis later on. So I think I will also do this outside. We're not going to do it word for word, but Ben Ish Chai, who was a early 20th century chief rabbi in Iraq, a very, very important modern halachic thinker, cites this in a completely surprising way, or perhaps maybe surprising to me, at least, in that he says, when it says ha-fochba, it actually doesn't mean reading Torah as text, hermeneutically engage with it, exegetically engage with it, turn it over, pick it apart, put it together, da-da-da. But rather, it actually has to do with what it means to apply Torah in the world, to live Torah. And not just that, but also, and here's something very powerful, that the nature of Torah is not just opposition, but transformation. Because lahafoch doesn't just mean to invert or to oppose, to turn it over. Lahafoch also means to transform, for something to become something else. And he says that the practice, right, the main feature of what it means to be engaging, I think he uses a Kabbalistic practice in specific, namely to identify and to derive holy sparks of God's being that are within the material world and to refine them. And he says that there's two transformations. One is to transform, to find the holy spark from, coarse matter and help it come to a more refined material state, i.e. when you're eating, not just to see it as fueling your body, but rather also as a way to in a more emotional, a more spiritual way, to be relating to matter itself, right, as to, let's say, a portal to something higher, and then to take the more refined relationship to matter and then transform that into spirituality. We don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but the point here, though, is that hafochma is about transformation, transforming the world through your engagement with it. So just as we are relating to the world as text through the lens of Torah, it's not just understanding it, but actually in that way helping it come into itself and advance. And not just that, but I would say also what you can find in this, application of this idea is that you too are transformed in that process as well. To engage with something or someone in a true dialogue doesn't just change the object of your attention, but you are the object of their attention too. You become transformed in that engagement. The practice of Torah is process, and the process of Torah is transformation. Here's a very terse but immensely beautiful teaching that we find in Sefer Otzar Eden Haganuz, treasure trove of the hidden Eden, which is a mystical text of Avraham Abulafi, a 13th century Kabbalist. Now, it might be the case he actually just has a different edition of the Mishnah, because I've found like another text that cites the same version of this teaching. or it's a gloss on it, because I've seen it written as a gloss before. A gloss is like not a full interpretation, but a way of kind of a riff on it. He says this: do not forget, but rather, hafochba v'hafochba, turn it over and turn it over, de kulach ba v'kula bach. Since all of you is in it, and all of it is in you. That's getting at, I think, the necessary realization that this relationship is not just about subject and object. I read the text to make it mean something. I find meaning in the passive text. The dead letter, I infuse them with living spirit. But rather, it is a symbiotic, dialogic relationship between two living creatures. Because it's not just it that you are reading, but rather you are in it, and it is in you. To go back to what we were saying before about authentic engagement, you are required for Torah to mean something, and Torah is required for you to mean something, to come to meaning. Torah cannot become meaningful without you, i.e. your experiences, your unique perspective, your creativity, your crystal clear reasoning, your daring imagination, your bleeding heart, whatever it is in you, helps Torah come to itself, facilitates Torah's actualization, and vice versa. That it is in you as well. You are formed by it just as much as you form it. It makes you too. You come to yourself through coming to it, and it comes to itself through coming to you. I want to conclude with this teaching from the Nesivos Olam, which is a book about values and about character by the Maharal, Rabbi Yehuda Loew of Prague, famous Bohemian rabbi living in the 16th century, who was also a mystic, but in his writings he kind of kept it a little bit more subtle. And he wasn't as, let's say, flamboyant in his Kabbalah. But you see his kind of a persistent mystical strain in his writing. So the Maharal says this, and this is, I think, an immensely, empowering point that can only be come to through the synthesis of Ben Bagbag and Ben Heihei, through the synthesis of turning it over, to transform the text through your transformation, to help the text come to itself through your own growth and evolution. And how that, like any process of growth, has pain, growing pains. I just want, before I was saying that, I hope that through, that the model that's being presented here is a sustained, persistent, resilient relationship with Torah that doesn't preclude or ignore the possibility that it can be one of pain. Whether it's just because, and I've experienced this a zillion times, you're cracking your head on something, you just don't get it, and it's annoying, and you feel dumb. That's real. But also, you can encounter something in Torah that's painful. You can go to a class in which the message is one that stings. You can, in your own reading of Torah, encounter something that you find difficult to tolerate, or you can't understand, or you find offensive. What I think the framework that's being offered here is one of patience and one of a lifetime. And also one of potential. that what one encounters at first, just as what we saw before from the Midrash Shmuel, is not necessary. And even what seems most likely is not what is required. But rather, Torah is bigger than us and bigger than what we could ever imagine. And thus, what it is that we encounter can also then be transformed through our engagement with it. There's political matters and there's legal matters, and it's a larger conversation, and it's a much more complex one than just to say, well, it's all in your hands. And that's not what I'm saying. But rather that Torah's potential unfolds in our engagement with it. And to reduce Torah to some kind of bottom line is that svara zara that Moshe dismissed. It's that idolatrous thinking in which Torah can only be one thing, reducing Torah to the truth. Torah produces truth through our engagement with it. That's the radical belief. That's the Jewish belief. So the Maharal says this. He says, "V'od ma'alat hamitzvot." A further advantage of the mitzvahs, i.e., what benefit they have. Shenotnim la'adam Allah ma'aleh madrega al ha'elyonim. That mitzvot, and by what mitzvot I want to kind of use that as a code as engagement with Torah and actualizing Torah in our lives, actually sends us further beyond even the angels. Torah's mitzvahs mean that we actually can reach higher than the angels. Why? It compels the mind to acknowledge this, and it obligates the intellect. Ki hanivraim kulam poalim et pulatam kfi tivam. The angelic creatures all perform their roles. They do what they're programmed to do. Angels are like robots. They do what they're programmed to do, according to their nature, to their programming, right? To their genetic code. Ve'ena mukrachim. They're not like obligated. They're not coerced into it. They're just an extension of God's will. They just do it. There's no selfhood. There's no subjectivity. There's no freedom. There's no choice. Angels just do. They emerge from the burning river, Dinur, and they return to it when their role is done. That's it. They don't have knees. They can just stand. They can't sit. They can't change their position because they can't change. Ve'ein lahem tsar. Angels don't feel pain. Kasher hemosim ratzon konam. When they do the will of God. Why? Because there's nothing resisting it. It's clear flowing water. Aval ha'adam. But human beings. Kasher hu kofeh et yitzro. When they coerce their inclinations. Right? They subjugate their urge. They address their baser natures. V'hu oser ratzon Hashem yisbarach b'torach gadol. And manage to fulfill God's will with great effort, exertion, challenge, difficulty, pain. What reward is greater than that? Kamosha amru zichron levracha, as the rabbis said, ben hehe, lefum sara agra. According to the pain is the reward. I.e., the fact that life is hard is why it's meaningful. If it came easy, if it came simply, if it came without a sense of resistance, it would mean in a way we weren't here at all. We're the ohm that creates, that light bulbs, right? Resistance is what's required to create light in any kind of electrical circuit. We're opaque. Light doesn't shine through us. Light hits us, bounces off, warms our skin, burns our skin. It's the challenge of what it means to devote yourself that is the basis of the meaning and even the reward. Because if it weren't hard, what would be rewarded? And I think this is really to the point. It is through the application of effort that the self is shown to exist. Right? Because what is it choosing to make that choice? And that choice can only be made when bumping up against what it would do otherwise. If there's something there that would rather do the other thing, then that is the self that is made through this. Not just shown to be, but just as we construct Torah and Torah constructs us, the self is what comes to be through this engagement. We are who we make ourselves to be through the engagement that is a lifelong practice and persistence. So, Pirkei Avot is a book of practical advice. So what's the practical takeaway here? Besides, we go into some very mystical and some very psychological places this evening. So I want us to be able to sit with this for a moment and just think about the perspective that Pirkei Avos, that Ben Bagbag and Ben Heihei are giving us. That a worthwhile and meaningful engagement requires a number of things. One is flexibility, to be able to not just push forward and see one thing, to snappishly decide, but rather to sit and to consider, right, as Rambam was saying, to be able to look into it, peer into it deeply, but also to even challenge ourselves, to challenge the immediate answers we come to resist the seduction of what seems obvious or even necessary. Because Torah, as a model, I think, teaches us to hold something and to look at every single side of it, to turn it over, even to turn it inside out, to transform it into its opposite, and to find how that is true too. That teaches you to help understand other people's perspectives, to develop empathy, to develop humility about the answers that we come to, and that when we do come to an answer at the end of an arduous process of consideration and interpretation, it's one that we can stand behind, feel confident in, and know why we're coming to it. We develop a greater level of self-consciousness by paying attention not just to what it is we're thinking, but how we're thinking, why we're thinking a certain kind of way. The self reveals itself through this engagement. It's not just an answer we come to, but the answer we come to realize is the result of thinking that is done by us. Everything that we think is done by us. And it is the most mature thinker that's able to never forget that. And thus to maintain a sense of modesty, I think, in the conclusions we come to, and a sense of contingency. Because it's necessary for us to be able to see not just how we came to the answer we decided upon, but also how we could have gone another way, and when we see others going a different way, to be able to at least understand how it is that they did this, even if we disagree. Understanding is not the same thing as agreement. Empathy is not the same thing as approval. I think we find ourselves most able to engage with others and most prepared and capable of engaging with others if we don't just see them as opposing us, but to realize that our own process is dependent on opposition, dependent on transformation, dependent on inversion, depending on turning something into its opposite to understand it in its fullness. And that then becomes a practice in life. How to be able to develop the tolerance and the resilience we need to be able to encounter something, to come to something and then to take it apart, to encounter something that we have a challenge accepting, but to be able to sit with it, to consider it from all sides, and to even maybe at the end not be able to sit with it in the same kind of way, but to be able to look within it and to find something in it that we can identify, and even maybe identify with. It's a practice of resilience, it's a practice of charity, by which I mean a loving practice of reading, and a way to lovingly engage with Torah, to lovingly engage with the book of the world, in the locution of the Reb Tzadok, and also to lovingly engage with each other, to see us all as infinite texts, ones that never stop coming to new readings. Thanks so much for joining. Susie, I will stick with you after. You want to say something now? Susie, you have the floor.
Considering sort of like the theme of today's class and what it takes to be able to really live Torah, understand or work with Torah, why did you include the passage about Torah being like a cipher to the world? Because, I mean, I enjoyed that passage. I have a lot of thoughts about that passage, but I'm not quite sure how it fits into everything else we're talking about today.
Well, it's the one passage that's not literally about the Pirkei Avot text, but it is about textuality. So I wanted to try to draw a bridge between not just Torah as literal book, and thus, oh yeah, we're just talking about what it means to like open up the Chumash and read that, and then read Rashi and see how Rashi's different than the Ramban, and Ramban's from the Ibn Ezra, and they're all talking to each other, and they're all different, and they're saying different things. But rather to say that what we're talking about is textuality, not just text. That things that don't even look like words are still texts in the sense that they are open to engagement. That the world is a book that's asking us to read it again and again, to look at every side of the bird, the plant, the flower, the human being, the war, the plague, the whatever, to be able to look at it and to relate to it not just as random events or not just as things, but rather as potentially meaningful occurrences. And then how does Torah Torah then is required for us to help ground ourselves in a framework of meaning, to help these things come to a sense of coherence. Right? And I look at the events around me, whether it's, COVID-19, homelessness in the city, me letting my mouth get away with me and accidentally offending a friend. All of these things, right? And Torah helps provide a line in on these things that help them come to be meaningful. I don't mean to say like, oh, really, it's all code and it's a prophecy that will be fulfilled, but rather Torah provides for us a path to navigate these events, to help us respond to them, to help us learn from them. So when I say cipher is, me, I always translate things with highfalutin words. It means code, right? That Torah is the key, the legend that helps us decode the world, help the world come to a sense of meaning. So it was an example of the bridge between the symbiotic relationship between the Torah and the world, and B, also the way in which what we're talking about is how to relate to texts as a way of how to relate to life. The resilience, the creativity, the patience that's required to come to a mature understanding of what text can mean, those same values and practices can be applied in our living, in our own behaviors as well. Does that help? Great. Okay. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. Our Pirkei Avot class will continue next week at 7:30. I hope to see you there. And we will have, again, I'm going to take another mulligan on Parsha Chat this week. I'm so sorry. I've got a friend visiting from out of town, so I will be busy. But I will see you at Shul at 7 o'clock in the evening, Friday evening for Kabbalah Shabbos, and 9:30 in the morning, Saturday morning for Shachris. I hope to see you there. And Havdalah, oh my God, it'll be so late, on Zoom, if you can make it, probably like 10:05 or something like that. I hope everyone has a great evening and a great week. Shavua Tov. See you real soon.